soup.
So hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's event, which is a reading from the late poems of Eugenio Montale by translator George Bradley and Professor Riccardo Bruscagli. If I could ask you if your microphone is on, if you are someone other than George or Riccardo, would you just make sure your microphone is muted? That would be helpful. Thank you. My name is Penelope Pelazon. I am an associate editor.
I'll have the soup later.
Oh, I think we may have, I'm going to just do a little bit of muting of microphones here, just to make sure that everyone is muted. Okay.
Did you mute Riccardo? Because you muted me as well.
Okay, yes, so sorry, I think I did mute Riccardo. So Riccardo, you might just want to unmute.
I'm back.
Okay, well, apologies. Okay, great. We are going to be celebrating today of the book Late Montale, which was just brought out this year by Waywiser Press. And I have dropped some information about that book in the chat bar, which is a link to our website and our web bookshop. So if you would like to acquire a copy of the book, you can just follow that link and that will lead you to it. So for today's event, George and Riccardo will take turns reading select poems from Late Montale, first in Italian and then in English, offering some context for each. And we're going to hear poems for about 40 minutes or so, after which there will be time for some questions from the audience. For anyone who's not familiar with the Zoom format, if there is anyone left on the planet, not familiar with Zoom, what you can do if you would like to, you can adjust your view. So you'll see that there's a little icon that says view up at the top of your screen. If you would like to see just the faces of the speaker, George or Riccardo, you can click that and it will give you a speaker view. If you wish to see everyone, you can leave the gallery view on, but you might want to just click on that link so that you can see just the beautiful faces of George and Riccardo on your screen. And I should just let people know that we are recording this event. So if you yourself would not like to appear on the screen, you can stop your video down below and that will just black your screen out. Okay, but you're welcome to keep your screen on if you would like. Let's see, any other little business here. Please, again, just make sure that you stay muted throughout the presentation unless you choose to ask a question at the end, in which case we'll ask you to unmute. So it's my pleasure now to introduce poet and translator George Bradley. George Bradley is the author of 6 books, most recently A Stroll in the Rain, New and Selected Poems from LSU Press, out last year. And among his awards are the Yale Younger Poets Prize, the Witter-Binner Prize from the Academy, the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, the Peter I.B. Lavin Award from the Academy of American Poets, an Ingram Merrill Prize, and a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And he is accompanied today by Professor Riccardo Bruscagli, who is an emeritus professor of Italian literature at the University of Florence. And Riccardo is an expert on poetry from various periods with a special attention to Carducci, Ariosto, Tasso, and Dante, as well, of course, as Montale. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and turn the screen over to George and Riccardo.
Thank you, Penelope. Thank you, Waywiser Press. Thank you, all of you attending. This is a project that was born in part from conversations that Riccardo and I had in Italy over several years. I think many American readers of poetry are enthusiastic about the poems of Eugenio Montale. There are some foreign poets who somehow become part of the discourse in American poetry. I would think that Baudelaire is such a poet, Rilke is such a poet, perhaps Constantine Cavafy is such a poet. And it may be that Montale is joining that group of people whose work influences American poetry, and the group of poets who, insofar as there's still poetry written, that expect you to have read other poetry, the group of poets that an American reader might be expected to have read before and to be able to apprehend references to that poet. Many people have translated Montale, particularly the earlier work by Montale that made him famous and that won him a Nobel Prize. The late work has been translated much less often. And part of what generated this book of translation is that there is a very small volume of mostly fragments and versions of poems with a few new poems that was excavated from a couple of notebooks that Montale left to his housekeeper, given to the manuscript collection at the University of Pavia, and published in a small book in 1986, following Montale's death, in Italy. And that had not been translated into English. And Montale is a poet of such stature that it seemed that everything that he wrote and left behind him should be available. And so we translated that. I translated the late work because it is much less often seen in English, and it has a very different character from the early work. The early work is known for being almost deliberately difficult or hermetic, and it is highly elusive to the literature of earlier Italian poetry. The late work is much more conversational, much more relaxed, much more self-referential perhaps, and much more revealing. And that is the work that I translated. And we can get started. Riccardo, what do you have to add? Anything?
I would say that you have been very modest in your presentation, because it's not just a question of translating, it's a question also of providing this late Montale with the footnotes, because the texts of Montale are not so easy to penetrate, even this more conversational phase of his poetry. And your footnotes and your explanations, especially for the little booklet you were referring to, are new also for Italian readers, because the late Montale has been commented upon up to a certain point. But you chose also from the really quite rare pieces, last pieces of his production. And so I would start with thanking you for this additional work, because Montale, yes, it's as we say many times, it's a referential poet, in the sense that his poetry is full of allusions to real life and episodes of his life, and characters and circumstances, and they are not easy to identify at all, like probably we'll have the time and the opportunity of illustrating in our conversation. So first of all, thank you from an Italianista, and sometimes foreigners really are worth of praise, because are the first one to address difficult aspects of our poetry. That happened with Dante over the years, who was discovered probably earlier by non-Italian philologists than by Italian philologists, and maybe this is what's going on here with Montale.
Thank you, Riccardo. I should thank Riccardo in turn for looking over the translations. And all I want to say is that there are any obvious errors, it's all Riccardo's fault, because he's read them all. I mean, he should know. Well, why don't we start with the poem that you say is perhaps the best known of the late work. There's a series of, well, two series of 14 poems apiece that Montale addressed to his wife after she had died. And this one is about going down a flight of stairs in some sense. And as we were discussing the other day, there is a proverb in Italian that la vita somiglia alle scale, c'è chi scende, c'è chi sale. Life is like a flight of stairs. Some people are going down, some people are going up. This is a poem addressed to his dead wife. It shows you a little bit of what Montale typically writes, addressing a woman, that there's an element of muse or of imagination at work, as well as a biography. Why don't you read it in Italian, the Xenia 2, number 5.
Ho sceso dandoti il braccio, almeno 1 milione di scale, e ora che non ci sei è il vuoto ad ogni gradino. Anche così è stato breve il nostro lungo viaggio. Il mio dura tuttora. Né più mi occorrono le coincidenze, le prenotazioni, le trappole, gli scorni di chi crede che la realtà sia quella che si vede. Ho sceso milioni di scale dandoti il braccio, non già perché con 4 occhi forse si vede di più. Con te le ho scese perché sapevo che di noi due le sole vere pupille, sebbene tanto offuscate, erano le tue.
And in English, that would be, lending you my arm, I went down at least 1,000,000 stairs, and now you're gone, each step is empty. All the same, our long journey together was short. Mine still continues, but I no longer need them. The connections, the reservations, the pitfalls, the scorn displayed by those who believe reality is what they see. I went down 1,000,000 stairs with you on my arm, not because 4 eyes might well see better than 2. I descended them in your company because I knew that between us, the true eyesight, even if opaque, was yours. I suppose we should point out that Montale's wife was notoriously myopic and nearsighted. She wore these great big thick glasses, so bottom glasses, and she was known as Mosca or fly because it gave her almost an insect-like appearance, these thick glasses.
And the fact is that during his life with Mosca, during their life together, he never wrote anything about her. He wrote about other women, but not about Mosca. And when she died, all of a sudden, surprisingly, there was this series of short poems centered to the incredible function that she had had in his life. Is in a way a posthumous homage to her, but to the reinvention of a character who had never appeared before in his poetry. And it's, I think, quite touching that he recognizes here how instead essential she had been as a, not so much as a muse, she becomes a muse after her death, but as a guide, and paradoxically somebody who was almost blind, but was able to lead him in the darkness of life. You translated, for example, now you're gone, each step is empty, which is very, very, very just. And in Italian, è il vuoto ad ogni gradino. The empty is not an adjective, it's a noun. So there is even a more tragic sense that at each step now there is like a vertigo, like a vast openness, like a darkness which opens up. And because probably she was the one who step by step had been able to create reality for him, step after step. And now that she's not there, to go down with him, the reality doesn't exist anymore. There is no life anymore to be seen or to be deciphered together.
Yeah. And what you said earlier, that now she has moved into the muse category because she is dead. Montale really needed to have a woman be in some sense imaginary before they could begin to operate in his poems, whether they were 1,000 miles away, whether they were estranged, whether they were dead. Better they should not be right next to him if he was going to work them into his poems.
Yeah. In a way, he's a very Italian poet, because since Dante or Petrarch, I mean, you have to be either inaccessible or, far away, or even better, dead in order to become the...
Or never to have existed to begin with.
Yeah,
that would be the other option.
To be just a figment of your imagination. And even if you are a real woman, you become, poetic only when you become the figment of your imagination.
Well, let's read another one from the same series. This is Xenia 2:14, and it's about the flood in Florence of November 4th, 1966. which you, Riccardo, remember well and even participated in the cleanup to some degree, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I lost my bicycle in that flood
It's
because
not mentioned here in the poem.
everybody lost something. So the bicycle is fine, and because really it was quite shocking to see this beautiful city transform into a sort of truly hell of mud and stench, and it was like really descending into a quite scary dimension of life for not such a brief a period of our lives. So the experience which is described in this poem was very common in those days, even though naturally here it becomes this reality of life, it becomes the metaphor for something else.
Tell us about walking through the city when it was flooded and your attempt not to fall into the funk.
Well, I remember that the first time that I went downtown with my friends, and we knew that something really dramatic had happened, and there were no lights around, but we thought it would be very adventurous, and I'm not saying funny, but almost. And instead, there was not one light around, only our flashlights, and the mud was everywhere, and you had to be very careful not to fall into something dangerous. And the people were really like shadows from the Divina Commedia, because there was all this circulation of shadows around us. It was very, very impressive. And then Florentines have enough spirit to react. But I remember the first night was really shocking.
When Riccardo says that you had to be careful not to fall into something dangerous, what he means is that the flood had blown the manhole covers up, and water and sewage had risen, as well as just the river overflowing. And that meant that if you're walking through water up to your waist, you had to keep your arms akimbo and your elbows well out, or you might fall through an open manhole and never be seen again down in the sewers.
Yes, this is exactly what I meant. And then there was also the tragedy which affected so many works of art in Florence. The loss of the crucifix of Cimabue was really heartbreaking. And when we arrived at the baptistry, the famous Porte del Paradiso had been not destroyed but dismantled by the violence of water. So there was also this aggression to the very heart of the city from this point of view, which was truly unpredicted.
Well, let's read the poem, which is not only about or not even principally about the damage suffered by the city, but the personal damage to belongings and above all to memory on the part of Montale. Go ahead, Riccardo.
L'alluvione ha sommerso il pack dei mobili, delle carte, dei quadri, che stipavano un sotterraneo chiuso a doppio lucchetto. Forse hanno ciecamente lottato i marocchini rossi, le sterminate dediche di Dubois, il timbro a ceralacca con la barba di Ezra, il Valéry di Alain, l'originale dei canti orfici, e poi qualche pennello da barba, 1000 cianfrusaglie e tutte le musiche di tuo fratello Silvio. 10-12 giorni sotto un'atroce morsura di nafta e sterco. Certo, hanno sofferto tanto prima di perdere la loro identità. Anch'io sono incrostato fino al collo, se il mio stato civile fu dubbio fin dall'inizio. Non torba ma assediato, ma gli eventi di una realtà incredibile e mai creduta. Di fronte ad essi il mio coraggio fu il primo dei tuoi prestiti e forse non l'hai saputo.
And in English, the floods swamped the clutter of furniture, of documents, of pictures crammed into a basement room closed with a double lock. Maybe they fought blindly, the leather-bound volumes, the endless dedications of Dubois, a wax seal stamped with Ezra's bearded profile, Alain's commentaries on Valéry, a first edition of the Canti Orfici, plus a few brushes for shaving, 1,000 knickknacks, and all the musical compositions of your brother, Silvio. 10 or 12 days under that terrible pressure of fuel oil and filth. Surely they suffered a lot while they were losing themselves. I too am fighting and up into my neck, although my civilian status was dubious from the start. It isn't dirt that's besieged me, but events of a reality so incredible I could never believe it. The courage I faced them with was your greatest gift to me, and maybe you never knew. You say in Italian that the word prestito involves a giving and receiving and a restitution that did not occur, yes?
And there's also a first version of this verse, which is a more explicit, era un tuo prestito senza interessi mai saldato, without interest. So she had given the courage that she recognizes here. Mosca had given this courage without expecting any reciprocation. And he knows that, and he recognizes here the immense generosity of that prestito, of that gift. But as I was saying, all of the description, and quite detailed description of all the memories destroyed by the flood, of different levels. I mean, because on one side there is a first edition of the Canti Orfici by Dino Campana, which is very
Rare.
very rare and precious.
And juxtaposed with a shaving brush.
Yeah, and together, yes, with the few brushes for shaving, and so it's a whole world of more or less precious and important memories which has been annihilated, and some of them, some of those memories had already been, forgotten, because the music composition, the musical composition of your brother Silvio, this brother Silvio Mosca, committed suicide very young, and composed music that nobody listened to, and never heard. So the flood killed once and forever those unknown musics. But all this becomes the metaphor of the torba, of the sterco, of the filth that is besieging the poet in the years that he's writing these poems, when his pessimism, let's say, his looks upon life becomes more and more radically negative. The only thing when Mosca, and as long as Mosca has been with him, was this courage of confronting, of resisting, of surviving the flood, the filth, and now even the courage is gone.
Well, you speak also of the repayment that was indicated in an earlier version. The poem itself is a sort of repayment, of course. Let's move on to another poem also about the same river, the Arno at Rovezzano, l'Arno a Rovezzano. This is, well, let's go ahead and read the poem first, then we can talk about it. You want to read it in Italian.
L'Arno a Rovezzano. I grandi fiumi sono l'immagine del tempo, crudele e impersonale. Osservati da un ponte, dichiarano la loro nullità inesorabile. Solo l'ansia esitante di qualche paludoso giuncheto, qualche specchio che riluca tra folte sterpaglie e borraccina, può svelare che l'acqua, come noi, pensa se stessa prima di farsi vortice e rapina. Tanto tempo è passato, nulla è scorso. Da quando ti cantavo al telefono, tu che fai l'addormentata col triplice chicchino. La tua casa era un lampo visto dal treno, curva sull'Arno come l'albero di Giuda che voleva proteggerla. Forse c'è ancora, o non è che una rovina. Tutta piena, mi dicevi, di insetti, inabitabile. Altro comfort fa per noi ora, altro sconforto.
Which in English would be, or could be, the Arno at Rovezzano. Rovezzano is a hamlet that was formerly on the outskirts of Florence and has now basically been engulfed by Florence. Great rivers are the image of time, cruel and impersonal. Seen from a bridge, they declare their nothingness to be inexorable. The mere lazy bend beside some swampy reed patch, a glassy reflection gleaming out of scrub growth and moss, can reveal the way water, like us, thinks about itself before moving on to whirlpools and destruction. So much time has gone by and nothing seems past since I was calling you up to sing that aria, Tu che fai l'addormentata, complete with its cackles of laughter. Glimpsed from a train, your house was a flash of light. It leaned over the river like the Judas tree that attempted to protect it. Maybe it still stands, or maybe it's nothing but a ruin. Full of flies, you told me, quite uninhabitable. It gives us other comfort now, other discomfort. Talk about the fact that comfort is not in Italian, and sconforto is Italian. What do you think?
I think it's ironic here because naturally the two words are opposite, but the Italian word would be conforto, conforto and sconforto. And instead, Montale chooses comfort and sconforto. And comfort in those days, and even now, is a word of the advertising industry. It's a kind of, not vulgar, but a very, common kind of word. Una casa con ogni comfort. So it is part of that jargon, that language, the contemporary language that Montale, especially in these late poems, truly hated.
But the late poems contain a combination of the popular and the high literary, sort of blended together, whether he likes it or not, which you can see in many other late 20th century authors as well.
It doesn't resist, it doesn't let's say, put on airs of superiority necessarily. He let the also vulgarity of the time contaminate him and his poetry. His poetry is also, his poem is also so interesting because it's an example of how packed a poem of Montale can be, and how many footnotes you need if you wanted to penetrate the significance of this poem, starting with the simple reference that you explained, l'Arno a Rovezzano. I don't know how many people in the world know what Rovezzano is or where it is. And plus, Montale himself declared very, naively, in a disarming way, writing to a friend that, to Isella, that there were 3 women in this poem, even though you have the impression that there is just one. But one was the woman who actually, was living in this inabitabile casa near Rovezzano, who was Dea Comune. He also gives us her name in this letter. And another one instead should be the woman to whom, over the phone, he would sing this aria from the Mefistofele, Tu che fai l'addormentata. And in this case, it was she was this Melanie Muska von Nagel, who, as we know, George, ended as
Let's give her her full name though before we get to that. Baroness Melanie Olivia Julia von Nagel zu Eichberg, married name Musa Yazul, who ended up becoming Sister Jerome in a Benedictine nunnery in Bethlehem, Connecticut.
Plus, you must be, you must be an expert of the opera in order to identify this aria Tu che fai l'addormentata from
Can you do the
Aristophanes,
three cackle for us, Riccardo?
Oh, no,
No, Riccardo actually has a beautiful operatic voice.
But but also we should remember the reader. Yeah, the reader at this point should remember or know that Montale for a while thought he had a career as a baritone, as a professional,
yes.
Yeah, as a professional opera singer. He took lessons. He arrived at the eve of his debut, but then I think he chickened, you say?
Chickened out, but also the person who was his
maestro, yeah.
Maestro was going to lead him. The introduction into the operatic world died, so it became a little harder.
But Montale was forever, when he moved to Milan, the musical critic of Corriere della Sera. By the way, that was the time of Maria Callas at La Scala. So he reviewed all the So and his poetry is quite full of references to opera, and he always made a point of elevating and declaring his preference for the opera, for the most, lurid aspect.
He lived 2 blocks away from La Scala Opera House, and I think at some point he said he hadn't missed a performance in years. He was always there. He was always there. Well, if he is a muse poet, let's read a poem directly about his muse. I think it's on page 27 for you, Riccardo, page 26. La mia musa, or my muse.
Okay.
You want to go ahead and read it? Yeah.
Sure. La mia musa. La mia musa è lontana. Si direbbe, è il pensiero dei più, che mai sia esistita. Seppure una ne fu, indossa i panni dello spaventacchio alzato a malapena su una scacchiera di viti. Sventola come può, ha resistito a monsoni, restando ritta solo un po' ingobbita. Se il vento cala, sa agitarsi ancora, quasi a dirmi: cammina, non temere, finché potrò vederti, ti darò vita. La mia musa ha lasciato da tempo un ripostiglio di sartoria teatrale, ed era ad alto bordo chi di lei si vestiva. Un giorno fu riempita di me e ne andò fiera. Ora ha ancora una manica e con quella dirige un suo quartetto di cannucce. È la sola musica che sopporto.
My muse. My muse is so far away now, you might say. It's what most people think. She never existed. If she ever did, she's been dressed as a scarecrow and raised barely above a grid of grapevines. She flaps in the wind as best she can, standing up under monsoons, just a tad hunched over. When the wind dies, she still knows how to stir, as if to tell me, don't be afraid to go on. So long as you're within my sight, I will give you life. My muse left a theater wardrobe quite some time ago, and those dressed in her costume used to be high class. There was a day that role was filled by me, and with me she went in style. Now she has one sleeve left and uses it to conduct a panpipe quartet. It's the only music I can bear.
Music, speaking of the presence of music in Montale's poetry, it's a very apparently at least self-deprecating poem. I mean, this music used to be grande dame, used to be high class, and now she's all she has just one manica left, and the music must have become a very humble music. Only to conduct a panpipe quartet, un quartetto di cannucce, è la sola musica che sopporto. You observe in your footnotes the difference that Montale had to, emphasize between his first manner of
Yes.
poetry and this poetry.
Here is acknowledging that it used to be something much more worked up and some more elegant and more theatrical in this presentation. And it's come down to something quite homely almost.
Used to be, his
style.
poetry used to be, or he as a poet, he used to be dressed in a frock, and now instead he's wearing a pajama. That is,
But that's an excellent point when you say he used to be dressed, because one thing that's evident everywhere in Montale's poetry, and is particularly emphasized in his late work, is how he feels that art and also life in itself is a theatrical presentation. It's a construct that the person or the artist works up. And this is a Shakespearean idea, but Montale feels it very deeply.
impersonating the style, and the style becomes like a costume. Yeah.
So,
And,
well, let's move on to one that is particularly apposite now in the world at the time of global warming and environmental degradation and whatnot. There's a poem set by the side of Lake Lugano in Campione, which is an enclave of Switzerland. Excuse me, it's an Italian territory within Switzerland. And I'm not sure it's immediately useful for this poem, but it's interesting to note that because the border, international border there was so porous, it was so easy to get back and forth to Switzerland, and the Swiss banks were there and their anonymity. It was for long notorious for money laundering, Campione. But this is called Lungo Lago, or Lakeside Drive, set at Campione. Why don't you go ahead and read it, Riccardo, if you have it there.
Lungo lago, il piccolo falco pescatore sfrecciò e finì in un vaso di terracotta fra i tanti di un muretto del lungolago. Nascosto nei garofani era visibile quel poco da non rendere impossibile un dialogo. Sei l'ultimo esemplare di una specie che io credevo estinta, così dissi. Ma la sovrabbondanza di voi uomini sortirà uguale effetto, mi fu risposto. Ora apprendo, osservai, che siete troppi o nessuno. Col privilegio vostro, disse il falchetto, che qualcuno di voi vedrà il balletto finale. A meno, ribattei, che tempo e spazio, fine e principio, non siano invenzioni umane, mentre tu col tuo becco hai divorato il tutto. Addio uomo, addio falco, dimentica la tua pesca. E tu scorda la tua senza becco e senza ali, omiciattolo, ometto. E il furfante dispare in un alone di porpora e di ruggine.
Lakeside.
And it's a dialogue, even though he's, it kind of astute because he doesn't mark the dialogue as such. I mean, you have to
know it, hear it, yeah.
to know who's talking in this scene.
But he makes it fairly clear, I would think. A small fishhawk sailed off to perch on a terracotta vase, one of the many on the low wall beside the lakeside drive. Hidden among the carnations, he was just visible enough so that dialogue wasn't impossible. You're the last survivor of a species I thought extinct, is what I said. Yes, but the overpopulation of you men dooms you to the same fate, was the reply. Now I grasp, I observed, that we must exist as either too many or none at all. With the difference, said the hawk, that one among you will be privileged to witness the last dance. Assuming, I shot back, that time and space, beginning and end, aren't entirely human inventions, whereas you, with your beak, have fed on the whole of existence. Farewell, man. Farewell. Forget about your fishing. And you forget about your fishing too, minus wings and beak, oh little man, homunculus. And the rascal disappeared into a halo of russet and maroon. I wonder how much the environmental, what should we say, apocalypse of this poem was in his mind. I mean, we read it that way now. I wonder if he did at the time.
And yes, at the same time, I mean, his apocalyptic vision and his idea, which is so present in this late poem, that really life has no sense, no meaning. And so the apocalypse is imminent on us, but maybe that doesn't make even so much difference, be different, because probably we think that we are living, but we might be as well already dead. That wouldn't make any difference. And what he says at a certain point, assuming that time and space, beginning and end, are merely human inventions.
Human invention, construction.
Because yeah, okay, but maybe you are right. You're right. I mean, we are going, you know, headlong into the final annihilation of the planet, but maybe this is just a concept in our brain. This is a residue of our ever-resisting, you know, idea that we are at the center of the universe, because we are the ones who really understand reality and the universe. Maybe we are wrong.
Maybe we're no more central than an osprey, than a fishhawk. Yeah.
There is no beginning.
Well, another poem about a muse, I think it's your page 104, Riccardo, which Alunna della Muse, which I have translated to a muse in training, which is perhaps a little bit of a liberal approach to translation. It literally means to a student of the muses, but an alumna is not a graduate student. And the poem itself at some point calls the muse a bimba, which does not mean the inflated blonde on the arm of a mafioso. It means a little girl, and is actually a term of some affection and charm. Why don't you read it in Italian?
Alunna delle muse, riempi il tuo bauletto dei tuoi carmina sacra o profana bimba mia e gettalo in una corrente che lo porti lontano e poi lo lasci imprigionato e mezzo scoperchiato tra il pietrisco. Può darsi che taluno ne tragga in salvo qualche foglio, forse il peggiore, e che importa. Il palato, il gusto degli dei sarà diverso dal nostro e non è detto che sia il migliore. Quello che importa è che dal bulicame s'affacci qualche cosa che ci dica non mi conosci, non ti conosco. Eppure abbiamo avuto in sorte la divina follia di essere qui e non là, vivi o sedicenti tali, bambina mia. E ora parti e non sia troppo chiuso il tuo bagaglio.
To a muse in training. Stuff your little suitcase with songs, sacred or profane, my baby girl, and launch it on the waters, that the stream may take it far away and then leave it embedded and half sprung open in the mire. Possibly some individual will extract the page to save it, maybe the worst one, but what matter? The palate, the taste of the gods is likely different from our own, and it's no sure thing it's better. What's important is that from the boiling current, some essence emerges to tell us, you don't know me, I don't know you. And yet we've been fated to the divine madness of existing here and not there. Alive, my child. We're telling ourselves as much. Now go, and may your bag be not too tightly closed. This is at once, what should we say, an ostentatiously humble poem and also a very proud poem. There's a line attributed, I think, to Golda Meir, don't be so humble, you're not that great.
Not that great.
Here, okay, it's just a little muse who probably doesn't even know what she's doing yet. And the poem that may survive into posterity is and perhaps with the worst poem that he ever wrote. But on the other hand, he is addressing himself to posterity and contemplating the possibility, I think, the hope that his work will survive. And so it's both humble and proud in a certain, or ambitious in a certain sense. Let's say that.
And yet at the same time, there is, I think, a touch of self-irony in
Oh, yeah.
the contrast between Alunna delle Muse, because Alunna delle Muse is a very neoclassic, noble expression. But this Alunna delle Muse is a bimba mia, is a bambina mia.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, this neoclassic figure becomes una bambina. It's a very confidential way of addressing somebody. And once again, at the center of the poem, and also in the vague hope that something will survive of this carmina, sacra or profana, is the fact that yet we have been fated to the divine madness of existing here, not there, alive, my child, or telling ourselves as much. Once again, I mean, life is, I was sure that we are alive, that we are alive. There's
It's
also
all part of our imagination.
Yeah, there's a
That's
short
a very
prose.
Spensian idea that it's that life as we understand it is simply a figment of our own imagination, really. Yeah.
There is a short prose also in Montale's, one of the Montale's collection of proses, where actually he imagines that somebody survives a car accident or thinks that he has survived a car accident, and then he realized that instead he's dead. So
It's a Cary Grant movie.
the border between being dead or alive is always very penetrable in this last Montale.
Yeah, permeable. We are beginning to run out of time. Let's read a couple from that last volume of poems that was extracted from notebooks, and then we can open it up to questions if we have time for it. What do you think? Maybe Non c'è dubbio che sia, that one? I think it's on your page 196.
You want to go back to Clizia with predictions?
Ah, that's good. The previsione. What page do you have for that? No, what page do you have for that?
Oh, predictions is 135.
And do you want to read it first?
Ok? Shall I? Previsioni. Ci rifugiammo nel giardino, pensile, se non sbaglio, per metterci al riparo dalle fanfaluche erotiche di un pensionante di fresco arrivo. E tu parlavi delle donne dei poeti, fatte per imbottire illeggibili carmi. Così sarà di me, aggiungesti di sottecchi. Restai di sasso. Poi dissi, dimentichi che la pallottola ignora chi la spara e ignora il suo bersaglio. Ma non siamo, disse Clizia, ai baracconi. E poi non credo che tu abbia armi da fuoco nel tuo bagaglio.
Predictions. We took refuge in the garden, a hanging one, if I'm not mistaken, to escape the erotic stories of a retiree who had just arrived. And you spoke of the women whom poets use to flesh out their unreadable odes. That'll be me, you added with a sly glance. I was struck dumb. Then I said, you forget that a bullet doesn't know who shot it and doesn't know its target. But we, said Clizia, aren't at a carnival booth. And besides, I don't think you're packing any pistols. You say this is one of your favorites, Riccardo? Yeah.
I must confess a predilection for Clizia among all the women in Montale's poetry. And this is a late Montale's poem when he goes back in his late age to this really touching moment of his life also, and not just his poetry, this love or infatuation for Clizia Irma Brandeis, this young woman from New York, who at a certain point seemed to have the power of extracting him from Italy and from his situation and even bringing him physically to the United States. But besides the lore and the legend which implies this episode of Montale's life, I think here it's really very interesting, the fact that for once the muse, the Beatrice of a poet, talks about herself. and imagines what will happen to her. Così sarà di me. I know what's going to be.
And she's not entirely happy with it. No.
And she's not happy. And the real Clizia, the real Irma Brandeis, was even less happy than she appears in this poem about her transfiguration into a figment of his
she would never
imagination.
talk about
She wanted to be a real woman in his life. She didn't want to become Clizia. But the way he evades the problem of the relationship between, let's say, life and poetry, when he says, well, you forget that the bullet doesn't know who shot it and doesn't know its target. So we don't know the origin of a poem, of an inspiration. We think that that poem comes from that circumstance of your life, but who knows? Who knows?
And art has its own cruelty and its own aims that in some sense use human beings, if you will. It is also a little Mae West in that last line about you don't have any pistols in your baggage, you know?
Well, again, that's very possible. That's very possible.
I think so. I mean, I think that there's, especially, I mean, they flee the erotic stories of this old storyteller who comes to the hotel. There is some hint of sexual inadequacy there, I think, which may have impacted their relationship. Who knows, you know? But it is interesting that he had written so many poems. I mean, the motets are the most famous, but many poems earlier. And then late in life, he returns. I think there may be, 11, 12, 14 poems that we included that he composed at the end of his life. Yeah.
And his relationship with the Clizia, really at the end, when he was very old, he made it very clear that it was a sort of adoration, not so much love, but adoration. So once again, she was put on a pedestal, like Beatrice, like Laura, like the big figures of our poetic tradition. And the interesting thing that instead the Clizia resisted so harshly also to this transfiguration. And one as a Florentine, I must reveal that this garden is the hanging garden, actually the Giardino Pensile of Pensione Annalena, across from the Boboli Garden, where Clizia and Brandeis
continue to go.
It's still there. It's still there. Still there if you want to, have in mind a little pilgrimage to.
So Penelope, what do you think? One more poem or what?
Well, it's 12:54. I think maybe if we want to have time for questions, maybe we should pause there.
All right.
And I'm wanted to turn it over to the audience now. People are welcome to, if you would like to drop a question into the chat bar, you can do that. If you would also, you're welcome to unmute and verbalize your question if you would like to do that. I'm actually going to shift to gallery view here so I can see people. I have some questions about your translation process, but I want to give other folks a chance to ask a question who might not be able to do that otherwise. So if there is anyone, feel free to speak.
And we may have to invent our own questions. I mean, that's always possible too. I have many. I mean,
I see, it looks like Phil is adding a question in the chat bar. I don't know, are you able to see the chat bar?
I just saw the address, George and Riccardo.
Let's see. Phil, I don't know if you had another, if you wanted to put a full question in, or did you want to, you can unmute and speak if you would like to.
Well, we can also go on and read another poem. That's the other possibility.
There was a question. I think it was more for you about another translator.
I had not read that translator. Yes.
Am I audible?
You are audible, Mr. Hoy.
George, nice to see you.
Likewise.
And thank you so much for your reading and for yours, Riccardo. It was a delight, and the discussion was just perfect. Really very interesting and throwing helpful light on the poems you were reading. George, I just wanted to ask, there were one or two points at which you departed from the printed text. nothing serious, but I wonder whether that was a deliberate updating of.
No, just lack of concentration.
Okay. Thanks. Well, that throws light on that. I want to make room for other people, but thanks again. It was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, we could close by reading one last poem if you want.
Actually, George, there is a question in the chat bar. So I would, Barbara Hamby asks, she says she would love to know a little bit more about your translation process. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how these poems came to be.
Well, you know, Barbara, pleasure to talk to you. The MONTALE is someone that I've sort of translated idly. Everybody has, I think anybody who's really interested in 20th century poetry who is a poet has probably thought about it. And so I try my hand at it too. But the notion of actually doing a continuous series of them, or actually a large number of them, happened when I discovered that there were poems that had not been translated into English. And that made it something that was not simply a habit in one's off hours or a pastime or a self-satisfaction, but then it became a project. How did I translate? I did it in one a day. I mean, I set out the poems that I wanted to translate. I would have a cup of coffee and read the poem in Italian in the morning. And then I would walk upstairs to the computer and sit down and type out a translation, a rough translation that day, come back to it and try and refine it somewhat. Eventually, I would send it to Riccardo. What he made of them, I don't know. I mean, maybe he burned them. But if he had any real objections, he would let me know. But that's the way that worked. And fortunately, Riccardo and I were able to be together in Italy upon occasion. I mean, we'd sit down with the original, such notes as other people had worked up, and my translations, and we'd go over them that way a little bit as well. So it's as everybody who translates sooner or later runs into the same issue. In the introductions to almost any book of translation, you will see it addressed. And that is, how strictly do you adhere to the original, and how much liberty do you give yourself in an attempt to bring the spirit of across as opposed to the literal words across. And I tried to cut the baby in half. I didn't want to depart too far, but I thought that a slavish obedience to the word order and to the cognate possibilities of the words would be obscure the meaning more than reveal the meaning. And I also wanted poems that would not sound stilted. It's very hard. You know, if you say the same word in English to yourself 10 times fast, you won't know how to spell it anymore, and it will sound odd to you. And people who are working so deeply in a translation will often create translations which are stilted, and they can't hear it anymore because they're so deeply involved with it. And I was very concerned that the poems have some of the same conversational appeal in English as they had in the original. If that helps.
I would just wanted to comment, Jordy, about I don't, or maybe I'm not even sure if it was Riccardo or I think it was you, Jordy. Well, I'm not sure. I was so fascinated with the poem that one of you commented on about, with the comment, life as we understand it is only a figment of our imagination, and you know, the dead, alive, you know, how it meshes. It was just totally attractive and fascinating to me. I can't say anything more intelligent about it than that, but it very compelling.
Well,
if I can remember, George, there's that poem in Satura when Montale says that Mosca and himself had devised a whistle in order to recognize themselves
in the afterlife.
Yeah, in the afterlife. And he says, I'm whistling now in the hope that all of us are dead without knowing it.
It's wonderful. And he also has poems in which the muses are essentially ghosts around him. He addresses them as ghosts. There is one that he hears about her death years after the actual fact, and he wonders if she's come to him in some sort of ghostly form in the interim. Yeah. So there's a lot of disbelieving in reality as it's palpably available to us, or at least expanding upon it, so that it contains what is probably available to us, and also what's available in our imagination sort of blend together.
It's crazy. It's great.
There's-
But if I can intrude again, the ability, let's say the ability, la bravura, we would say in Italian, of George has been that this is a poet, I think, which keeps from the first season of Dante's poetry this metaphysical depth, but it's also conversational, as we have already said. And the translation of George was able to combine and to keep these two dimensions of Montale's poetry, which in my sense make him so distinct and recognizable voice in our contemporary Italian poetry. This compresenza of metaphysical dimension and a conversational attitude, and I think that the translation perfectly keeps together these two aspects of the poetry.
George and Riccardo, there's another question, the kind of an interesting follow-on to that, perhaps, from Professor Tom Dawkins in the chat bar. Tom writes, I'd love to hear more about your own understanding of Montale's muses. Since they are imagined figures for him, how did you imagine your own imaginations and desires into the translation process? That's a great question.
Well, they're imagined figures. Stephen says that reality is only the base, but it is the base. And Montale's muses are, in some sense, imaginary creations or figures that help his imagination, but they were based on real human beings with whom he did have interactions. And he has a very interesting poem called Questions Without an Answer, Domande senza risposta, in which he says people keep asking him if it's one muse only or if it's many muses, if it's one woman or if it's many. He says, I can't answer that question. I'm working almost in twilight, and what I make out is a figure that's maybe a composite of them all. And all I know is that the language is not fully able to grasp that, and that I'm waiting to meet them again. And he ends the poem by saying, goodbye, my beloved ghosts. I'll be with you soon.
Addio mie larve, addio mie larve. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And actually that was infuriating sometimes for the real women who wanted to appropriate and wanted to, be recognized as the music, especially Clizia. There was a nice exchange between, not so nice exchange between the two about Costa San Giorgio, one of the poems. And so she said, is it me or is it somebody else?
it's not that easy.
It was a merging, a superimposition, I don't know how to say, of more than just two women, actually.
But they cannot be the actual real human being entirely, because as we've pointed out, they only arrive in his poems when they are no longer fully real for him, when they are distant. And in fact, when he went to the US, which he only did for 3 days or something, he did not meet with Clizia. He met with the daughter of the owner of the Pensione Annalena, Clizia's friend, but he did not meet with Clizia herself. He was in New York City. It would have been easy. She was in New Jersey. I mean, it would not have been hard. He didn't want to do it. So,
and I think that she didn't want either.
Well, that's possible too. That's possible too. As I say, she didn't like to talk about it. Well,
she was very upset when the identity of Clizia was revealed. She was very, very.
And for everybody,
when Luciano Lebai, this professor by Columbia, revealed that the woman in the Occasioni was her. She was
Irma Brandeis. We should tell everybody that Irma Brandeis, who was a scholar and published scholarly books on Dante herself, or at least one. I think it's called The Ladder of Vision. Yes, but she survives in people's memory, partly on the basis of her scholarship, but also partly because she exists as such a large presence in Montale's poetry. So.
Great. So there's actually one other question that popped up that's interesting. I'm not sure, how much maybe you have some information about AI translations that are beyond mine. But Robert Knapp asks, what about computer translations? Are they, or can they ever be poetic? And I imagine, Robert, you're thinking about something like with Python programming or something like that, but
You just put it into Google and see what comes back. Why didn't I think of that? It would save so much time. You know, obviously they will get better and better. Eventually, the chess program is able to beat the grandmaster, but they're not there yet. And what you get out of the online translations may be useful if you have to call a cab and tell them where you're going. But as far as translating a poem by Montale, you don't get the full thing or anything like it, and you may get many distortions. So, but the dictionary Treccani is online, and that was very useful. So there are online resources that are useful, but just a straight translation online, artificial intelligence translation, I did not find useful anyway. But you know, the reference material that you find online, certainly Riccardo was talking earlier about the notes for the book, and I found that not everything, but a great deal was available online that would not have been available to someone doing a translation 40 years ago. And if they didn't have the information then, they're not to be blamed. It just wasn't as easy to uncover. And so I felt that it was important to get that into the public sphere if I could. So that's one reason for the extensive notes, which can be forgotten about by people who don't want them. You don't have to turn there. You know.
Even in the subject, Montale had his own personal view, because he had to a certain point he said, okay, I know that my poetry is difficult and it needs some clarification, but not too much, not too much. Un giusto mezzo between non capire nulla e capire troppo. So he also kind of thought that his poems must retain and keep some sort of ambiguity. Even though there is always a reality, there is always an explanation, there is always a possibility of, you know, penetrating the meaning and focusing. But insomma, no, fra capire troppo e non capire nulla, un giusto mezzo.
James Merrill used to say, why are people so afraid of a poem in which they don't know everything? There's something that they don't know. Why is that frightening? It doesn't have to be. But he may also have been talking about biographical information, that he only wanted to reveal so much of himself.
It was also a sort of, I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to ask a question for Riccardo, really. George, you began by saying how important, obviously, Montale has been for English language poets. I just wonder what his standing is in contemporary Italy. Is he still read? Is he still regarded as a major figure of the 20th century?
I'd say, you know, that in our literature, we like the Trinity. So we have Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarca, and then we have Foscolo, Manzoni, and Leopardi, and then we have Saba, Ungaretti, and Montale for the 20th century. But I dare to say that Montale is becoming more and more, is revealing himself more and more like the most complex. And I'm not saying the best, but the most complex. And even, for example, now there is a new review, a new magazine, and I think the second issue is of Studi Montaliani. There is a whole magazine dedicated to Montale. And this hasn't happened for Ungaretti or for Saba. It doesn't mean anything in a way. I mean, it doesn't mean that, I mean, it's odious to put hierarchies between among great poets. But if you are asking about the standing, about the reputation, the consideration, I'd say that of the 20th century Trinity, Montale probably is coming up more and more like the most relevant of them.
Thank you.
It's always dangerous for a foreign speaker to try and arrive at a final opinion about a poet working in a language that's not his own. I've seen Italians make what I consider gross errors of appreciation about American poets. And it's maybe odious to have comparisons between poets, but I'll say it, Montale is the best Italian 20th century poet, but by an order of magnitude. I mean,
I agree, but I wouldn't be so blatant this way. But I agree. I'm not the only one, because as I said, it seems to me that in terms also of scholarship and he has grown over the years, and we have now beautiful editions of his at least first books of poetry. And as I said, I mean, recently this new magazine totally dedicated to studi montaliani. That means something.
Thank you.
This is great. Really wonderful to hear the poems aloud, and to hear Riccardo, to hear them in your voice was lovely. And George, just to hear you put them in your voice too, after getting to know your translations on the page, it's really lovely to just appreciate them this way. I am seeing the time, and I know that some people might need to get on to other events. So I think that we might wrap up here, but I just wanted to put a plug again in that if you would like to obtain a copy of this wonderful book, these wonderful translations, there is a link in the chat bar just up at the top if you scroll up, and those are on the Waywiser Press page. We'll take you to our bookshop and you can purchase the book there. And I would just like to thank everyone for coming today, and thank you, George and Riccardo, for this beautiful volume, and for all the labor of love that this clearly was, for you, George, and then Riccardo, for bringing your voice to this today.
thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.